Hi everyone, and welcome to the Chat Lead. My name is Bella Probin. I'm the Artist Development Coordinator here, and I'm so delighted to have Gill Crawshaw with us today for Panic in Conversation. And just a bit about Panic. Panic is an artist-steered program which uses talks and sharing to critically engage with the entanglements of the axis of power. Aidan Moesby is an artist, curator, writer and cultural access consultant who explores civic and personal well-being and climate change. Gill Crawshaw is an independent curator and disability activist and is one of the founders of Disrupt, which is a collective of disabled artists in Leeds. And Aidan and Gill are going to be talking together, drawing on their experiences and discussing approaches to cultural strategies to instigate change and enable equity and access. Many thanks to Anna Smith, who will be interpreting this conversation in British Sign Language, and a recorded version of this event will be available to watch on YouTube as well later on. So just a bit about the format. Aidan and Gill are going to speak for roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for a Q&A. So the Q&A is going to be from people that we have here in the room, but also online. So if you're joining us on YouTube, please use the Q&A function. And that's enough from me, and I'll hand over to Gill and Aidan. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. So we thought that it would be useful just to give you a bit of context about how we ended up where we are. So I'm Aidan Moesby, I'm an artist and curator, working mostly with climate change and well-being, and looking at external physical weather and the internal psycho-emotional weather. And that's mostly through multi-format artworks. So an artwork which might have several iterations, it might be a performance and an installation and a film, for example. And I make art not as an end in itself, but as most likely as a beginning. I'm interested in the conversations which stem from that art and how those conversations can bring about positive social change. I wasn't born with a disability, I acquired it, and I think that gives me a different perspective on how I experience the cultural world from that context of identifying as a disabled neurodivergent artist and curator, as opposed to like kind of a more normative neurotypical experience of my earlier life. And so engaging in or becoming an artist and having had a background in other careers, both as an environmentalist and as a therapist, coming into the art world was a bit of a kind of, I came with different eyes, and some of the things that I saw was like, I couldn't believe that they existed. And then also there was a lot of codification that I didn't understand. I haven't been to art college. I don't have that peer group. And the art world is an extremely codified place, and it's an extremely privileged place. And not having been through that system, partly it's a blessing and partly it's a bit of a curse as well, or initially it was. And now I'm quite happy that I haven't been, because I'm pleased with that perspective. And then also there was the issue about when I began to identify as disabled, it's like also that it tied up with trying to identify as an artist, and then truly finding and coming across disability art was kind of like, oh right, yeah, so this is kind of what speaks to me, and I found it like an accepting place, somewhere where I didn't have to explain myself, and somewhere where it was, yeah, we were speaking a common language, but also I was still existing and trying to operate within a normative experience of the art world. So largely, my experience is it's kind of binary between kind of existing as a disabled artist in a disabled context, showing work around disability, and then showing work in a normative context, not necessarily about disability, and how your work is viewed differently depending on those contexts. And also about like the cultural value around how disabled people, but also disabled artists, and how that is affected within the kind of normative art world, and then trying to navigate a way within this world, and then finding that initially as a disabled person it was like kind of set up to fail, because that's what disabled people, we don't complete, we can't do work that's very good, and we won't deliver. And I found that there was a lot of the constructs in the art world was set up to reinforce that. And then I had an experience where I went to Dundee Contemporary Arts, and I had a residency there. It was like, well, how can we enable you to do the job to the best of your ability? And I'll come back and talk about that experience probably more in the conversation with Gill. And I was like, oh, right, so it doesn't have to be like that. You can actually be kind of empowered to do the best that you can and make the best work that you can, and be the best artist that you can. And that was a real shift for me. And I think now I know that the conversation has changed around access and what we can ask for. But back then in the 2010, it was difficult. The same conversations weren't around. So if you wanted Roubaix Day, it was like, whoa, what's that? Certainly not getting paid for it. And then kind of the and how this has become more and more into the language and the negotiations that we can have about work, and then wanting to become more of a kind of a cultural leader, but not knowing how to do that, and then also not being able to be in an institution and being a freelancer, and the ability to have that kind of finding your voice and being able to exert your agency without being the difficult one, and all that kind of negative stuff that can bring, and all the kind of extra precarity and emotional labour that can bring. And then going through some more of the kind of, so I went and did an MA in curating, and disability wasn't discussed within that MA unless I brought it up. And now doing a PhD, and finding myself doing a PhD, which is a scientific construct, but actually coming from a practice-based, artistic, disabled, neurodivergent kind of context, is throwing all that up into the mix. And so that's just a brief kind of sketch of where I am, and hand over to Gill now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was a couple of things I thought, well, when you said that really resonates with me as well. So I'm Gill, based here in Leeds. I'm a curator. I always feel slightly uneasy saying that. I'm a curator. I write and research stuff as well. My focus is on disabled people's lives, disability issues. I'm a disabled person. I work with disabled artists, not entirely, but I again work a lot with disabled artists, and I'm interested in disabled artists getting the recognition that they deserve. And as Bella said, recently in Leeds we've set up a collective of disabled artists that's called Disrupt. Maybe that'll come up a bit later. Just to say a bit about how I got here. My life and career has not been in the arts. Donkeys years ago, I did a degree in textile design. That's what brought me to Leeds. But then I've had a career that's been in social care, local authority, equality as a disability equality officer, and in the third sector, a health and wellbeing network. So that's what I've worked at. Certainly, I've not been a curator up until quite recently. And I'll finish this bit with that story about what brought me into curating, I suppose. And what always been interested in the arts and I've always been engaged with the arts. And again, going back, you know, I've been involved in the disabled people's movement, particularly in the late 80s and through the 90s. And so at that time, particularly, the disabled people's movement and the disability arts movement in the UK were just really absolutely very closely linked. The disability arts movement then was by and large a political movement. It was disability arts was art made by disabled artists that reflected their experiences of living in a disabled society. That's what disability arts was. You know, different, a bit different than disabled artists who might be making art about whatever, which of course many of them were doing. So I'd had that experience in the movement. I've been involved in the Disabled People's Direct Action Network for a long time. I was a work organiser for that, which was also called DAN for short. Now, if people might not remember, depending on your age, but DAN was the group of disabled people that used to handcuff and chain themselves to buses and trains and stop traffic and that sort of thing. So yeah, very much about direct action. So yeah, that's my background. I wasn't born a disabled person either. I became disabled while I was at university. But by that time, you know, then my identity, that sort of really solidified my identity as a disabled person. So when I got returned to disability arts, I suppose, about 7 years ago, I think, then, you know, my identity as a disabled person was certainly very well established. So yes, as I say, you know, I've done, organised a few exhibitions and events and things like that that really centre disabled people and disabled people's experiences. I'm going to go back to the, you know, tell you the little tale about what got me into curating that was in 2014 here in Leeds, when Grace and Perry's exhibition of tapestries, which was called The Vanity of Small Differences, was going to be shown in Leeds. I found out about that. I thought, yes, I'm interested in textiles. I found my Grace and Perry. I might like to volunteer for that. So I went to a session for potential volunteers where I found out that right at the end of the session, by the way, actually, some of the tapestries are going to be up a small flight of stairs, so they won't be accessible to everybody. And this was in an old house in Leeds. So yeah, there were issues around making it accessible, but you know, the question arose is why put something that was going to appeal to a lot of people in a place that wasn't fully accessible? So, you know, my heart sank. I raised an objection, but thought, what can be done? It's all too late. I know that, you know, there's only a couple of months to go now before the exhibition opens. What can be done? Did a few tweets, knowing it would make no difference whatsoever, wrote a letter of complaint to the head of museums, knowing that would make no difference whatsoever. It didn't. We got into a bit of a spat about it. Yeah, so it's like, oh, yeah, this is going nowhere. It's not going to change anything. What can we do? You know, having been involved in direct action, thinking I really don't want to stage a picket outside the place again. You know, that was me from years ago. I don't want to do that anymore. And instead, though, I had the idea of let's put on a counter exhibition of work by disabled artists that's textile-based work, so that related to the tapestries, and let's make sure that that exhibition opens on the same date as the Grace and Perry exhibition opens. So let's try and, you know, pull some attention away. I don't know, make a point, have a protest, but have a protest that was also maybe something, you know, creative or positive. But at first, you know, there was very little time, and my thinking was, look, this sounds terrible. This will sound terrible. It doesn't matter what the art's like. It doesn't matter. We just need to get something on the wall. We've only got 2 months. But it turned out through various people's support. I mean, I used curator space. People may well know about curator space, and that was fantastic and made a massive difference. And you know, have the support of Inkwell and Union 105, which is about Fee Street Arts for venues. But yes, we're able to reach out to artists across Yorkshire. That was the boundary I set for practicality, really, and put on an exhibition in 2 venues that did open on the same day as the Graceland Perry exhibition, and was, you know, a fantastic exhibition with really interesting work by artists using textiles in all sorts of imaginative and innovative ways. And, you know, loads of people came and loads of people liked it. So I won't get into, you know, that, but clearly there was an appetite to see work by disabled artists in Leeds. But we're talking about change and whether it made any difference, I suppose. And it's hard to think that, you know, just doing a one-off event or project can really make much difference to things. At the time, though, it was quite nice. Whenever the Yorkshire Post or the Evening Post did a spread about the Graceland Perry exhibition, at the end of it, it said, oh, and by the way, there's this other exhibition by disabled artists that's happening at the same time as a protest. So that was quite nice. And actually, it made a practical difference at the time because a lot of people within the council were saying, yeah, it's not right what we're doing this, it shouldn't be, it's not right, we've got to do something about it. And they put in some sort of stair lift that went up these final steps. And I'm not saying that would suit everybody, but it did mean that some people who couldn't get up there were able to get up there. So that was like a really, really practical result. And then I think, you know, well, the legacy of that has been more work being shown by disabled artists in Leeds, and that people sort of starting to think about who disabled artists are and what their work is. So, you know, it's affected some change within, outside, yeah. I think it was, yeah. So I think it was, you know, a good thing to do.
I mean, that reminds me of the Jeremy Deller monument in Manchester, and how, and just thinking about like how we think about access and how we think about inclusion and who's designing and who it's for. And I'm very much interested in public space. Now, we're in a city with not very much public space. We're in a city with like a lot of space that looks public, but actually it's all owned by private corporations. And there's quite a lot, you know, just even close to here, there's little signs that say, this is not a public space. And it's like, and public spaces are designed, you know, so people don't linger, so that they aren't accessible, so that they are acoustically, you know, insensitive. And we want people to move through them. And I'm just thinking about like how the design of our public space transfers to public buildings. And, you know, we were having a conversation just before this, and I think when we think about disability and we think about access, the easy, quick win is let's put a ramp in and let's put a lift in and then that's solved. But I don't think it's as easy as that. I think, like for me, it's not necessarily about physical access. It's much more about psychological access. And then when I'm in the, and I guess as we're in a cultural institution organisation, and then I'm also thinking about how can I access, why am I here, and how can what have I come to see, and how can I access that to the best kind of. So it's about like, so for me it makes a difference that is actually a door, not a wall, even though it looks very much like a wall, it's actually a door. So that makes me, psychologically, that makes me a little bit more kind of hypersensitive, so I couldn't sit where Gill is sitting, for example. And then I think about, you know, about how we, I guess if it was like about computers or whatever, we'd be thinking about the user experience. And it's like how, you know, how do we hang out? What makes it accessible? Why should it be accessible? You know, is it about big letters and no curly fonts and things like that? Was it, you know, and then how nuanced do we go? Is it about like the acoustics that we think about? Is it about like the brightness? And I also am aware that we can't make everything accessible for everybody all the time. I mean, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, a few things, loads of things to say there, aren't there? I mean, it's, you know, people often say, similar to what you said, Aidan, you know, that access isn't all about, it isn't just about ramps and lifts, but ramps and lifts is a really important part of it. And a lot of what you're talking about as well is about the built environment, how that affects people, how it's more accessible, not just for people with mobility impairment. Also, I would say, you know, I've heard this a few times recently when people say, oh, ramps and lifts, that's an easy answer, that's an easy solution to it. Well, it isn't, is it? Because otherwise we'd be seeing big lifts and ramps all over the place and wet mentions, and we don't. So it isn't easy at all. It doesn't seem to be easy. It's not happening fast enough or enough places. And there are some cost issues to that as well. But I mean, I was just saying to somebody recently, what I like about, I don't know whether you call it the disabled people's movement anymore, I don't know whether that's the right word, but what I like about sort of the discussions around disability and access now, more than they were in the past, is that it's much more about people's relationships with each other and how people are treated and care. You might want to say something a bit more about care. But yeah, that's much more part of the picture is, yeah, being welcoming, being kind, being respectful are all really, really, really important elements of making things more accessible and inclusive.
I think some of it is just about, you know, we use the term access and equality and stuff like that, but I think some of it is just about good hosting.
Yeah.
And about being a good host.
Yeah.
And about making somebody welcome. And, you know, if someone comes to your house, you know, it's like you welcome them in, have you got everything? Do you want to drink? Do you want, you know, and it's like, take a seat. And, you know, it's just an extension of that. I know it's different and comes with, you know, you've got different responsibilities, but essentially it's just about good hosting and making sure that people can experience where you are in a, you know, in an appropriate way.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And giving them a big thing, isn't it, is giving people time, giving people space, giving people options, being flexible, all those sorts of things are all part of the picture.
But also, I mean, I'm interested in access, not as, you know, I mean, obviously we'll get on to talking about the pandemic, because I don't think like we can avoid talking about it. But I think, you know, I'm interested in access from home to home and that experience. So it's like, I like, you know, if I'm going somewhere new, possibly I like a little photo journey on the web. And so I can see, I've got to get off at that train station, and then I see that telephone box, and then I turn right, and then there's a bridge, and I cross the bridge, and then there's that pub. You know, and it's really simple to do that, and you only have to do it once from the station, and once from the bus station, and, you know, once from the car park. It's like, it's not something that costs an awful lot. People think about access, and it's about, oh, it's too expensive. And actually, it isn't. It doesn't have to be, because hosting and welcoming doesn't have to cost anything very much at all. And having these like signposts and a sign as you come into, I mean, just staying in a hotel, I went up the stairs, there was no signage as to which direction my room was in or anything, so I'm wandering around and, you know, getting increasingly anxious, stuff like that. Just like signposting. It's like these little things can make a massive difference to how people feel as they go there. And then what about the experience when they get there? You know, being greeted, good signage, knowing, you know, having things available and the information which is appropriate for you. And, you know, those kind of...
Yeah, it's absolutely powerful. Yeah. I mean, we're sort of talking a bit, we've talked a bit from, you know, being outside organisations, maybe. But I think, Aidan, you've got a bit more experience, I would say, of working within arts organisations to try and shift thinking, to try and get things changed. I mean, I'm going to say, you know, my experience is not within arts organisations, it's maybe within local authority more, but, you know, there might be something relevant there. I'm sure there is, but that, you know, how you can try and change a culture of an organisation and how, you know, welcoming an organisation is from inside and how that's maybe a bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as a professional kind of, you have these key moments which you think, oh, right, that's been a major thing in my life. And I can think back to several, but the most recent one is, so Dash Arts, Disability Arts Shropshire, has been running a program, Future Curators program, 3 disabled curators in 3 the Dash program is that it's not a knee-jerk, it's about sustained systemic change over a long period, which requires a lot of investment from the organisation. Curator, and it's about working in, well, definitely working in collaboration. So it was a great experience working. I got to see what it's like working in an institution, and it's changed a lot of the way that I perhaps approach things, and maybe a lot more kind of politic and strategic. I still have that fire in my belly, but I might just say things a little bit differently now. And but also it's about like having those conversations about not just about how it can be accessible for me. And now that I'm finished that, I think, all right, so like now I can do the job, now I can do the work, but I couldn't necessarily do the job because the structure around those jobs and institutions are inaccessible to me. It's like, how much reasonable adjustment would somebody have to make in order to make it possible for me to do that job, which I'm perfectly capable of doing. But the structures, the 9 to 5, the when you can access, where you work from, all of that kind of stuff. It's like, we need to change these. And yes, there's ways of change, doing your direct action. It was, that was quite a subversive act, I think. But, we're both quite long in the tooth, and we've both been on the demonstration front line. But also, that's not always the way to change. And sometimes by being inside and having conversations and showing good practice, you can change that, or challenging in an appropriate way. Sometimes it's okay to call people out on Twitter, and sometimes I guess it's not. And also about, it's not just what it's like, the access for me as a curator, but it's about the access for the audience, the people who work there, the other people who visit, who come in, like tech people, just everybody who enters, because it exists in a community. Here exists in a community. Disabled people are like at least 20% of the population.
I was interested in what you were saying about the curators program and WEMA, because sometimes if you put a disabled person in a place, then the expectation on them that they're going to change something on their own is ridiculous, is just ridiculously high, and they can't achieve that. Of course they can't on their own. So it was quite good to hear that actually that's just part of a wider program that WEMA and the other arts organisations that are taking part in that programme are already engaged, or already committed to being more inclusive. And so hosting one of the disabled curators is just part of that. So it's not all the pressure isn't on that disabled curator to be the fount of all knowledge and be always the one who's challenging. And at the end of that year, or however long the programme is, that there'll be incredible changes will have happened there because of that one person. That's just absolutely impossible, isn't it?
Well, I think the risk is that you do, when you're part of a minority or a marginalised group or intersectional identity, that you do a lot of emotional labour. You're the go-to person because you're the disabled person, you're the queer person, you know, you're the person of colour. And it's like, actually, that's not that or my responsibility. It's like, you know, it's got to, oh, I don't know anything about that. It's like, well, we can read, we can ask questions, we can, you know, we can learn. It's like, you know, and it's an organisational, institutional responsibility. And part of that programme was that they underwent training from DASH. So it's like it spread right across the organisation. And I didn't feel like it fell to me. But it was like, I can introduce them to this person, and then that changes and it become like, introduce them to disability arts online, about streaming, and now that, you know, it's like kind of built in. And it's about building in those networks and building in best practice and holding up your hand. And, you know, I hear this, well, you know, we didn't want to do anything because we were scared of getting it wrong. You know, so let's just not do anything.
Which happens all the time, doesn't it? I was interested in what you were saying, that, you know, having done that programme, you maybe sometimes approach things a bit differently or express things a bit differently. Because I was thinking, you know, sometimes I just worry that in some of the projects that I've done now, that they're just too tame, that they're not angry enough, and that I'm trying to be too accommodating. That they just don't quite have the bite that they did. And the reason for that, the reason why I'm pulling the punches, I think, is because, you know, I know people within the arts, I know people in various arts organisations, big and small, and there's loads of fantastic people who, you know, many of them, most of them, really trying to do the best and really do want to change things. But that sort of made me think, oh, I don't want to be too hard on them. But the other thing that's also affecting me is a sort of general mood of, you know, anger and how quickly people can get into arguments, whether they're, you know, online, and how entrenched people's opinions are about things. And I'm just wondering, you know, if we did do another demo about something, actually, would that be counterproductive? Would it wind more people up than it? So, you know, sometimes I think, I need to be more angry, but how can I be angry? And this is, I've no answer to this. This is just what I'm thinking about myself in, you know, in the work that I do. Because most of that, well, all of that is definitely outside of organisations.
But being angry is great. It's like, where do you direct that? And if you use your anger as a source of a drive and you do it appropriately, then it's great. You know, it's like working with climate change. My fear is that we say climate change, oh, it's so, you know, it's so bad, and then we've got to do something about it. But then we paint the picture as so bad that then you're paralysed and you don't do anything, and you're put into that kind of, you know, you're so afraid and you're so anxious that you just don't do anything. And I think, you know, the situation is quite bad, and we do need to be angry. And I think a lot of the gains that we made as a, you know, as a disabled movement, disability arts movement, has been lost. And I think, you know, we look at, I mean, honestly, I'm tired of saying it. You know, I'm tired of saying when I show my work in a non, you know, I came up with this model of the disability trinity. So it's like, you know, we have a normative space with a normative curator, a normative art in a normative space, and a disability curator, disabled curator in a disability context, and a disabled building, you know, accessible building. And you show work in this context, and it's like you're devalued as an artist, you're devalued as a person, you're devalued as a professional. And over here, you know, you've just got to look at like the amount of disabled artists who are in mainstream prime white cube galleries or any white space or any, you know, cultural institution as the main feature. And it's like, it's still okay down the corridor to the toilets, but very rarely, you know. And then, you know, it's just like, before I went to Lima, I put on an exhibition in London, and it was like every single one of those works and artists could have been in a white cube in a not, you know, because the work is critically robust, it's critically strong, it stands out as a, you know, as quality, whether you like it or not is irrelevant, but it's quality work. And it's like, why isn't it represented? Why, 20% of the people, we just not represented in like the number of people who work in culture, who are shown in culture, all of that kind, you know, it's just like, so when you say, oh, I don't know about being,
Yeah.
you know, and things have got to change, but also it does, you know, we look at disabled people and either we are like Olympian heroes and so inspirational. How do you get out of bed every day? That's amazing. And, or you've got like a spare bedroom and you're a total scrounger and, you know, disability hate crimes and all of this kind of stuff. The binary that we exist in a society.
For sure. And there's nothing that I'm not angry at. Maybe I'm
Good.
Yeah, it's about how you express that anger and what you know, and how you get that anger to change something, you know, and how, if that's, you know, how you make that injustice round again. So it was that really. I'm just going back to what you were saying about, you know, how many disabled artists are there in mainstream galleries, exhibitions, your good white cube spaces, whatever, how many are there? You know, something that gets levelled back at me, and I'm sure you've heard this, is, well, how do you know? How do you know? Maybe loads of disabled, loads of these artists might be disabled. We're not going to put a label on all of them saying this is a disabled artist, this is a disabled artist. And of course, that's not what we're asking for at all. And actually, yeah, it's true, there might be disabled artists, so I'd be surprised if there's many, but there might be some disabled artists in mainstream settings, and actually, most people aren't aware that they're disabled artists, but some people will be. Some of those people will be disabled people who are visiting that gallery and seeing that work, and that will mean something to them. If those artists are given those opportunities, then are given more opportunities, then they have a bit of a platform as well. And some of those disabled artists are going to talk about being disabled artists. And so, you know, that sort of ball runs on.
But also, I mean, you know, people like Frida Kahlo, you know, completely appropriated by the mainstream.
Yes.
And, you know, when I'm thinking about, so occasionally I do this thing with the Tate search engine, disability versus dogs. And so I put in the disability as a search term and you come up with like 200 odd results. And then you put in any other term, whether it's seasonal or, you know, whatever, you know, frost or snow or whatever. And then it comes out with a whole load more terms. And it's like, you know, disabled artists are being written out of the art canon, you know, and why, you know, that is, you know, the most majorly funded institution. And it's like, why isn't there more disabled references, disability references? You know, it's things like that. And I think about the pandemic and my experience during the pandemic, and like everybody else, my work got cancelled. But then during the preceding lockdowns, I got some work and I was on some panels and we were talking about stuff and like people were interested in access and you know, and initially some of those meetings that I went to weren't subtitled, even though, like, you know, they're freely available. And they weren't signed. And then I was in one meeting and said, well, why isn't it signed? And they're just like, where's the access? And they totally ignored it. And then enough people said, yes, where's the access? And then they had to stop it. And then they hold their hands up and say, yeah, you know, well, we haven't got any money for access. Well, why isn't it a budget line? Why is it not one of the first things on there rather than an afterthought, which is mostly what access is?
Yes.
You know, and then we were talking about like Build Back Better and being more inclusive and Black Lives Matters and, you know, a whole range of intersectionalities and about better representation. And, you know, it's like institutions have opened again and it's, instead of that Build Back Better, it's the same old shit. It's like we are less, or, you know, we've gone back because we've gone back to being as inaccessible. Because I think, you know, those access tools have always been available, but it was driven by the normative, people who are in charge, who have the power, who have the agency, and it satisfied their needs at the time. And now, it's like, oh, we can be back in the building, we don't need to do that anymore.
Yes.
And it's like, again, it's like taking the agency away from, disabled people.
Yeah.
And we have to beg,
Yes, yeah. Well, I wonder where those good intentions then have gone to and why that is, and whether it's just pressures of reopening and, and an onslaught of work. I wonder where, those that you're saying, that you experienced some good stuff during the pandemic, but that's all fallen by the wayside. I'm just trying to understand why that might be.
But we can be pragmatic and say, yes, everybody is busy. And, we've had the conversations about trying to fit in 18 months worth of program into 3 months of, or before the next financial year. But that doesn't mean to say that we can forget about everything. It's like, institutional ableism is the same as institutional racism and sexism and homophobia and all of that. It's, it shouldn't be accessible. It shouldn't be, allowed, but it is.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we set up Disrupt during the pandemic, actually, and that arose out of an online exhibition that was called Possible All Along, that was, that was sort of referencing the games, some of the games in terms of making things more accessible that happened during the pandemic that were suddenly, that we've been told for years before, were not possible, were too expensive, we can't take things online, we can't do it digitally or remotely, it's just too complicated. And then suddenly it turned out that it was, in fact, possible all along to do those things. And, and our hope that that would continue once the pandemic abates, I don't know, but on the back of that, then we set up Disrupt, which is a collective of disabled artists in Leeds. And, one of the things that we're saying is that, we're here and we're prepared to be a critical friend to arts organisations, that we're here, we've got the expertise, use that expertise, let's see if that happens. Maybe it's early days to know whether, we'll be taken up on that.
But I think that's a great approach, but, there's also that kind of stay in your lane-ness, or kind of, well, we're the institution, and we, about agency and power, and how do you negotiate that?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is about, like, having ongoing conversations. It's like, I know that when I'm like either an artist or a curator going to work with an organisation, the access conversation that I have is only ever the first access conversation that I have, because it has to be an ongoing, because you don't always know what's going to crop up. And you don't always know what the situation is going to be.
Yes.
And I think, we've got to create this kind of atmosphere where it's safe to have those conversations, regardless whether you're an incoming artist or curator or you work. I look at like the Arts Council reports and look at like some of the figures around disability in some organisations, and I wonder, why haven't they got any disabled people? And I wonder, is it because it's not safe to say that you're disabled? Is there still a stigma about it?
Yeah.
Is there still, what is that about? And how can we have these conversations in an open, honest, non-kind of, kind of way,
Yes.
and without that kind of friction, and use it as a learning point. And it's okay for organisations, I think, to get things wrong and to fail, and as long as they go, right, yeah, we got that totally wrong, because you can't get it right all the time.
Yeah.
And rather than like trying to like double down, just go, yeah, we got it wrong. How do we do it better? Can someone tell me? Because I don't know. I don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
I get it wrong,
And I guess that's what we're trying to do with Disrupt, is have those conversations. As you said, and try and do that. I mean, apart from anything else, I just think there's so many interesting conversations to have. It's like because we haven't had enough conversations about disability and access. Because there's loads of interesting stuff to be said. There's loads, for sure, there's loads of interesting art out there, because there's a set of artists who we haven't heard from. We haven't been able to hear what their view of the world is, because, you know, they've been shut out of things. Yeah. I think I absolutely agree with you. It's important that there are those conversations as well with individual artists. But what's also really important, and I don't know if we're seeing enough of, is that organisations have got strategies around this, that they've got plans in place, they've got strategies around improving access. So yes, for sure, you have to be prepared to meet particular, maybe specific access needs of artists who you're working with. But also you need to have something bigger than that, some strategy that says, this is how we're going to approach this over the next few years. And I don't know, if organisations do have those strategies, they're not publicising them, they're not blowing their own trumpet about them. So we need more of that as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that we haven't touched heavily on is care. You know, and I think care is really, really important, and compassion and gentleness. And, you know, having had other careers, it's like I can see how harsh at times the art world is. And I think, you know, yes, there's some really brilliant practice, but I think also there is some like really atrocious practice, whether that is about, you know, about pay and conditions or what, you know, whatever, and just the expectations about what we expect of people who, not just incoming artists, but also people who work within the organisation. And I think, you know, we can think about access and equality and voices and agency and power and who has that. But I also, you know, if we get it right for one group of people, it's like if you're caring or care about, or there's the care there for a certain part of the population, and it's you know, say disabled people, then you might also make it more caring for like a parent and child, or an older person, or people with like different, you know, who are othered in other ways.
Yes.
And I think it's not just, you know, if you make it better for one, you make it better for more.
Yes. I mean, we've had a bit of debate about this word care, and you know, and it can, and I would say it's not how I would ever frame anything. It can be a bit of a tricky word. But I think if we're talking about, you know, you can also talk about caring about rights and caring about justice, you know, and if we think about it in that way, that was something that, yeah, makes sense as well, let's say, yes. Because, you know, the disabled people's movement and disabled people always say, you know, disabled people don't need care. We don't need caring for. What we want is rights, what we want is respect. We don't want, because care can be a loaded word in some ways about, you know, we can move us more into thinking about charity and thinking about, you know, all these poor disabled people wrapped up in cotton. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, you know, care about what's right. Yeah.
So that is a
maybe
time to stop, I think.
Brilliant, yeah, thank you both so much. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we will come back for some questions. So yeah, be thinking of them, and if you're online, feel free to start posting in the chat. Thanks. Brilliant, thank you. Hi, welcome back, and thanks again so much to Aidan. Now, so I wondered if there were any questions, and if you say them yourself, I'll speak them into the microphone, and hopefully get an answer as well. Were there any questions here? Okay.
I have a question, which was kind of something in the spirit of the not doing nothing, but doing something in a positive vein. Because you mentioned right at the beginning, Aidan, something around access and how it's become much more okay to ask for or to expect access as an artist or curator to be taken into account. I just wondered what the next shift might be. The next positive move might be that organisations and institutions could take in the spirit of doing something rather than doing nothing. Is there something that you would like to see as kind of the next shift?
Great, thank you. So yeah, I think the gist of the question is basically, is there, what would you like to see as the next positive step for change to happen?
Where do you start? Ideally, I'd like not to have to for that not to be a question, that everything is in place. But I think like right from the start, we have to strip it right back. So even from the point of like thinking about job applications, how do we put out the information there, or proposals? How do we decrease the labour involved? How do we decrease the anxiety? How do we make that information and that process as easy and as accessible as possible? Whether that's actually applying for a job or applying for a proposal, and yeah, let's look at Grantium, for example. And how we build in these levels of difficulty in order to, I think a lot of it is about gatekeeping. So the easier that we make things, the more democratic we can make it. And I think the more people can have the opportunity to apply or to be part of something. And I think that, that those conversations now have to come from the institutions and be led from the, that it's okay for a person to instigate those conversations and ask. I know that I was the difficult person, and I know that I didn't work for a while because I was too difficult to work with, because I asked for stuff and I challenged stuff, and the conversation, the conversations I was trying to have were too early. Whereas like now, we have things like Access Docs for Artists, absolutely fantastic resource, but these should be in place and be encouraged by the organisations, and yeah, it's just the whole thing. Again, it goes back to hosting as well. So when you're on site and having those visits or coming for the interview, just everything has to be thought about with care at the heart. And how can we make it open to the most number of people and to be equal? And I mean equal in parity in a true, authentic sense.
Yeah.
Does that answer go somewhere?
I mean, yes, because I was about, I was thinking of it so practically. I just had this debate, is to work with more disabled artists. And of course, it's not just disabled artists, it's artists of colour, it's queer artists as well. Work with more disabled artists and employ more disabled people in the organisation. So you were talking a bit of a step back before that about applications and things like that, but that's just what needs to happen to change organisations. I mean, another very easy, I think, thing that organisations can think about if they've got a public space is set up a quiet room, set up a quiet space. Yeah.
But I think also, for me, it's also about democratisation, and it's about gatekeepers. It's about gatekeepers holding the doors open instead of keeping them shut, and about holding the ladders down instead of lifting them up. But, and And I think about like knowledge, and disabled people and people who are marginalised and othered tend to have barriers such as finance. They're not just barriered in terms of like opportunities, but they have less digital resources, they have less money, they have, you know, it's like an onion that you just keep peeling and it's more barriers after more barriers. And I think like, you know, there's a lot of organisations with a lot of kit that just sit idle most of the time, or a lot of the time. It's like, why don't we invite artists in to be able to use those computers, or use Adobe, or use, you know, the film editing and or the cameras and stuff like that. And you know, we make it, we democratize not just like the buildings, but the resources and everything and knowledge. And that's where, you know, I see a lot of this in like the Scandinavian countries, where the libraries, you can just like go and take, you know, use whatever you want in a much more kind of freer way. And here it's like the doors are shut a lot of the time, and that shouldn't be. So when you think about like making things easier and getting access, it goes, we can't just like, oh, it's about this, or it's about that, it's about everything. Yeah. It's about like reinventing the structure. I don't think like revolution is the answer, but it needs a big evolution and a complete change of thought about what organisations are and what they mean and what they can give and provide.
Yeah, and arts organisations ought to be the best at doing that, actually. They ought to be leading the way, or you know. Yeah.
Hi. This is a bit rude, cheeky. Can I respond to that question with for me, it's the biggest barrier that I face is about time.
Can I bring you the microphone and then
Yeah, or I can just speak louder. And it's about the ableism of time. And so if I had to make a request of an organisation, I would say whatever the lead-in time you've got, double it. Because it, like, as a disabled person, it's really hard to turn things around. There's a kind of hurry sickness in arts organisations where it's like, could you, yeah, so I suppose I would just say a big request is the ableism of time and having longer lead-ins, because there's a hurry sickness in arts organisations that makes them ask for things yesterday, tomorrow, and if you're disabled, that is a real point of anxiety. So, yeah, that was just an opinion, not a question. I'm now going to just follow up with a question. And anger, and thinking about who is allowed to be angry, and who is allowed to voice anger, and how we navigate anger to people that might be providing our wages, I suppose. I'd be interested to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah. I mean, as well, I mean, I think, you know, disabled people get stereotyped as, you know, as being angry, as always complaining, as moaning. And so, you know, if you're aware of that, then it's like, how do you express that? But definitely, yeah. How do you do that? I mean, the important thing is to gather with peers, find peers for support. So whether that's, you know, the artists union or a trade union, if that's appropriate, so that you've got some support, so that you're not on your own in expressing and voicing your anger. I think that's really important. Because, yeah, it's really difficult if those are the people who are paying wages. Aidan talked about that earlier, about, you know, how that worry in your early career that you weren't going to get other work because you were too much trouble. So that was really difficult. So it's really important, I think, to find other people, to find your peers, to find people who can support you.
My therapist would say, everybody's allowed to be angry. But it's how you act, how you enact that anger. You know, we can think about like a toddler having a tantrum on the floor, screaming, fists, feet, you know. Or we can say, okay, I feel really angry, I'm going to do this. And it might be, dear sir, it has come to my attention, you know, and writing a letter. Or it might be something more direct. But again, I think a lot of it is about how safe we feel. And some of that is about the amount of agency that we have as individuals. and about how equal we feel and where that power dynamic lies. And what, you know, and there's always an issue when you're dealing with an institution, an organization, a funder, that they naturally have more power. And how they use the power is really, really important. They can like seed it and include you, or they can like load it. And I think that's really, really important. And again, that goes back to care and compassion and equality and parity. And I think, you know, the issue with, it goes with the issue of time and where does the power lie? You as an artist can say, okay, so I need this amount of time to do it. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But then, you know, but then when it's the organization that is like having, right, we need it by tomorrow. You know, even though we've had these negotiations and we've written it all down in contracts and stuff like that. And it's, yeah.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I was just interested, I think, Aidan, you talking about your experience in Scandinavia, but also your experience at DCA as an artist and at MEMA as a curator. And if you had any really good examples of something that you thought was fantastic practice that really made a great difference that you would want to see rolled out elsewhere.
So I'm just going to repeat the question. The gist of it, I think, definitely is, what examples of best practice have you come across that you can share with us?
So I'll come to that in a minute. I'm instantly reminded of, I did a residency in a forensic psychiatry unit where I went with a colleague every single Wednesday for a year. Every single Wednesday, we'd knock on the door and then say, yes, and go, we've come to do, you know, and they go, oh, who are you? And it's like, you know, every Wednesday for a whole year, and still, you know, and that stands out as like really bad practice, lack of communication, terrible hosting, you know, where was like the buy-in, all of that kind of stuff. And I'm just reminded, so yeah, I had a really positive experience at Dundee Contemporary Arts back in 2011, which was my first major like residency. And it really, yeah, it shifted an awful lot for me. Everybody knew why I was there, right across the building. And we had conversations about how can they make my time there the most fruitful? What do I need? I was introduced to everybody, and we worked around like how I can make the most use of my time and take time off and not be too, you know, not because I know that I do so much one day, I need to have it has a cost the next day or 2 days later. And how can we build in these times? And, you know, I as an artist have a responsibility to deliver. I don't, just because I have a disability, it doesn't take away any responsibility that I have about delivering work and quality, on time, and budget, all of that. And I think, so yeah, that kind of institution-wide. And also when I went to MEMA, I hadn't even started, and I was in the cafe, and Laura Sillars walked past, and she was with somebody. And, you know, I've been in lots of organizations where the head of the organization would just walk past you and ignore you. Whereas actually she knew who I was and I would be coming there, and then and introduced me to the person who I was with. And I was like astounded at that, you know. And then the day that I arrived, it's like everybody knew that I was coming, they knew why I was there was like a team meeting, there was like, you know, there was buy-in right across the organization. There was conversations about who you were doing, what with, each department had time with them. I was embedded. I could drop into conversations. It was like, you know, everybody was disturbable, and it's just like a really, you know, it was a really massively positive experience. And then obviously, like during that time, the pandemic occurred. But then it was like, how can we still make this really successful? And it was the constant like kind of just the constant conversations. I had a key person. I knew who to deal with. If they weren't available, I knew who I could go to. They knew me. Just, you know, and I'm somebody who calls out bad practice pretty readily, and I don't gloss, and so, you know, I'm not kind of over-egging it. It just really was a transformative experience that, you know, and also having an ongoing relationship with the institution, and that change for them and me is sustainable, and, you know, and now working towards like the next phase of bringing in three more institutions and being part of that process. And it's like, rather than just being, see ya, you know, and it's like it's this kind of sustainable development of a career that is meaningful. It's not just like, all right, that's it. We've ticked the diversity box. We've done the disabled people. Who should we do next? And it's not like that. It's like, it's really, you know, yeah. So it's like right through the organisation, and it's a positive experience, not just for me, but I think for all those involved.
Thank you. Hi, is there any question here?
Yeah, what have you tried to speak about how your previous political activity involved your curatorial practice? Just to make that more circular, does your knowledge and experience of curation affect how you think political activity should take place?
So I'll just repeat that. So does your knowledge and experience of curation impact how you now think about the political practice side of things?
Yeah, I think it does, and I'm sort of, this was a bit what I alluded to, I think, when I was talking about anger and being angry and how you express your anger, because I'm slightly worried that I'm toning that down a bit by using the arts rather than politics. I don't know. Yes, it has, but yeah, I'm concerned as well that sometimes that curatorial activism, if I can call it that, is too much directed at the arts and cultural world and not enough reflecting that. I do other things, and I do try and raise wider issues that affect disabled people actually through some of the projects, but there's one or two where I think, this is just getting a bit internal, a bit about thinking about art and not about how that has a wider implication. So, yeah, if that sort of answers your question. Yeah. Sometimes I feel I'm getting a bit sidetracked. That's me, that won't be your answer, anything there at all, I'm sure.
I think for me, identifying as a disabled person is a political act, and everything comes from that.
Yeah. Yes, and it's important because the arts and culture is just, you know, the major way of expressing that and showing that. And that's, you know, I do think it's important to be using the art to try and make political points, and why it's important that disabled artists are recognised properly. That's why I do think that's important, because, you know, this is representation, and that's so very important.
But I think also you have to think about what you're foregrounding. Are you foregrounding the art? Are you foregrounding the political motives? Are you foregrounding the artists? And I think that within a political context has to be considered as well. And, you know, what you do and the story you tell and what you tell it with changes on those component parts, and also the impact that it can have, and I guess ultimately what change or what is the effect that you want to have with what you're doing and why. So yeah, we could spend all night discussing that.
I think that's foregrounding the action and the impacts.
But yeah, that shifts, doesn't it, depending on the project. That shifts depending on the project and what you're trying to do with it. Yeah.
But But also, I mean, it depends on, you know, when I think about climate change, and people make work which is kind of informative or to challenge or a call to action, and it varies on what they want. And some people make kind of, you know, spectacle, and they just want the big wow, or some people, you know, want to kind of have some kind of emotional impact, or to kind of, yeah, to act as a catalyst to something else, to engage, whatever that engagement is.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question if there was one. No? Okay. Great, well, so yeah, thank you all for joining us. Thanks again so much, Jill and Aidan and Anna. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
The bar's still open if you did want to stay for a drink and more of a chat.